So the next most simple phylum of animals is Phylum Cnidaria. So unlike sponges, Phylum Cnidaria do have true tissues, and we're going to look at what they're called, what the two types of tissues are. Um, Cnidarians have radial symmetry, so sponges were asymmetrical, whereas these guys do have a type of symmetry in their adult stages and their juvenile stages. And there's about a little over almost 9,000 species. So almost 9,000 species of cnidarians. So there's a lot of these. This includes um, sea anemones, corals, jellyfish, Portuguese man of war, hydras. We're going to look at all the different types of them. The biggest characteristic, so one of the characteristics that defines this phylum is the presence of stinging cells. Now, these are unique to Phylum Cnidaria, and while there are other animals out there that sting, like a wasp or a bee might sting, they don't have these true stinging cells. They sting with venom. Stinging cells are different, so we're going to look at what they are and how they work, but that's a characteristic that all members of Cnidaria have. Unlike sponges, cnidarians do have some very, very, very basic sensory organs. Basically, they have cells that can detect the presence or absence of light, so they can move towards or away from light. And that's pretty much it. That's the extent of their nervous system. And these also have a very basic muscular system, just in the sense that they have a ring of muscular tissue. When you think of a jellyfish kind of pulsating its way through the water, it's that ring of muscular tissue that allows it to move that way. So we'll look at some basics about cnidarians. There's basically two body types that cnidarians can have, and some types have both body types during their lifetime. Others will only inhabit one body type during their lifetime. The medusa is a term for the free-floating, usually it's the adult or mature stage of a cnidarian's life. So jellyfish, for example, are medusas. So medusa is like a bell shape with tentacles hanging from it, whereas the polyp is basically the benthic form of this. So benthic means bottom dwelling. So a polyp is kind of like an upside down medusa that's attached to the bottom. So these guys have kind of a cylinder shape with tentacles coming out the top, and the top area there is where its mouth-anus is located. So these guys have one opening, that's it. It's its mouth and it's its anus. It sounds kind of gross, but they're actually not as gross as you might think. So a polyp might be, for example, an anemone is a polyp. So it's like an upside down jellyfish. Both of these stages have an outer layer of epidermis. So this is true tissues. A big distinction here, true tissues, all the cells are connected to each other and kind of working together. Whereas with the sponge, which had sort of false tissues, it had individual cells that were kind of stuck together, but they weren't really connected and sharing things and working together necessarily. So that's the big distinction between something without tissues and something that has true tissues, are the cells connected and working together? And if they are, then it's a tissue. So epidermis is the outer layer for cnidarians. Inside the body, so if you think of like up inside of the bell of a jellyfish, would be its gastrovascular cavity. And between those two layers, you've got the mesoglia. So the jelly-like substance that makes up the jellyfish is called mesoglia. So if we look here, here's a polyp. So a polyp, again, it's like an upside-down version of the jellyfish. The bottom here is stuck to a rock or stuck to the bottom of the ocean, the sediment. And then you've got the outer tissue. So this outer blue layer of tissue would be the epidermis. The yellow tissue would be what's called gastrodermis. So gastrodermis lines the gastrovascular cavity, and that's like the gut, the very basic gut of the animal. And then in between the two, the sort of pale blue area is called the mesoglia. So that's the sort of jelly-like, it's mostly water and just tissue, basically, that makes it up. The mouth-anus here at the top, and then tentacles. So if we look at a medusa or the jellyfish shape, it's kind of the same thing, it's just upside down. So it's the other orientation, but it has all the same parts. So same thing, here's the gastrovascular cavity, here's the gastrodermis, the mesoglia is this jelly-like area right here, and then the epidermis is the thin dark blue layer around the outside. Same thing, mouth and anus are in the same place. So about those stinging cells. The stinging cells, again, they're called nematocysts, and the nematocysts are cells that are embedded within the tissue of the tentacles. So as you might have learned from watching Finding Nemo, there are no stinging cells in the top bell part of the medusa. So you can touch and pick up the top and you're not going to get stung. But the tentacles are the ones that have the nematocysts embedded in them. So here's an example. Here's this sort of peach color might be the tentacle, and then you've got here the little cells embedded in the tentacle. So these are the nematocysts, and basically they function kind of like a coiled spring with a little trigger. The trigger is called the cnidacyl. That's this little thing here, and then down inside is this coiled thread of poison, and attached to the end of it is the barb. And so what happens is if the jellyfish brushes up against something or something touches it, then it triggers the cnidacyl, which releases the barb with a little thread attached like this. So it's like a little harpoon that gets shot up. And that release is what delivers the sting. So the sting you feel is the barb, but it's also the poison that's made up by this thread, this protein thread. Here's another diagram of what an actual nematocyst might look like. So these little cells are embedded everywhere in the tentacles of jellyfish and anemones and corals, and they are the reason why you get a horrible sting if you brush up against them. So they require contact, although there are some species that can actually trigger them just because of certain chemical signals in the water. So basically, there's a chemical signal in the water that basically gives the impression of a threat to the jellyfish, and that can deploy their nematocyst that way. So it's pretty rare. Most of the time, there has to be contact. In some cases, they can be found on other body parts, but the bell is pretty much always safe, so you can always pick them up by the top. Some have a more deadly sting than others. For example, there's several species of what are called box jellyfish, and these are found in the South Pacific, mostly Australian waters. Pretty much instant death if you brush up against this thing, which is pretty frightening. There's a lot of species of them. Some people have survived them, so they're not always deadly. Just depends, but for the most part, it's usually death if you brush up against them. So yeah, it's a little bit scary. We'll look now at the different types of cnidarians. So we classify cnidarians into 3 basic groups. The first is class Hydrozoa. So hydrozoans are a class of cnidarians that consist of colonies of polyps. So these guys are in the polyp phase as adults, and these polyps oftentimes, so here's what one polyp might look like. It's kind of like a long, narrow body stalk, and then the tentacles coming off the end. Sometimes a whole polyp has sort of little buds growing off of it that have different functions. So some of them might have a feeding polyp or a gastrozoid growing off of it, and then in other parts of the body it'll have a reproductive polyp or a gonozoid. So these are both examples of reproductive polyps. Some of them will actually be floating colonies. So if you've ever seen or heard of a Portuguese man-of-war, the Portuguese man-o'-war is actually not a jellyfish. It's technically in this category of polyp. So it's actually a floating colony of hydras, which is pretty cool. Others can produce a skeleton, so hydrocorals, which aren't true corals because they're technically hydras. So hydras is this first class, Hydrozoa. The next class is a little bit more familiar to you, so Scyphozoa. These are the true jellyfish. These guys have polyp and medusa stages. So they spend most of their life, their adult life, in the medusa stage. Jellyfish will float with the current, so they're technically considered plankton. Even though they can kind of contract their muscle and move a little bit, they're technically plankton because they don't have a lot of control over their motion. In the top of the bell is where you have these photoreceptors. So if you were to look at the jellyfish from the top, you would see a couple of small, faint little circles right here that make up the light receptors. So these guys can move towards or away from light. So here's the basic body plan, and you'll see all the parts that we already talked about. Their gonads tend to be located kind of up near the center of the bell. So if you look at it from upside down, that's what you see here. So it's reproductive parts here in the center. So you can see they can get pretty huge too. So here's one that's just as big as a human. It's pretty cool. Sometimes they're not actually, the bell isn't actually that big, but their tentacles can be very long. They can be even 30 feet long, which is pretty crazy. And the third class is Anthozoa. So this is going to be sea anemones and corals. These guys only have a polyp stage, and they're benthic, so they're always sessile as adults. So sea anemones, for example, they're stuck to things, although some of them, sometimes they can come loose and kind of drift a little bit, but they have no control over their motion, so they're technically sessile. Again, you've got the mouth and the oral cavity here at the top. What happens with anemones, as you might know if you've ever touched one, is if you touch it, the tentacles are sensitive and they will retract. There's a sphincter muscle here at the top that will close that opening, so it'll protect it from a predator. The stinging cells are not always going to feel painful to you. They might just feel kind of sticky, which is what you'll feel if you ever go to like a touch tank at an aquarium and they let you touch them. The tentacles will probably have a sticky feel to them. As you might also know from Finding Nemo, this is a great opportunity for symbiosis. Little clownfish will live among the tentacles of the anemone, and they've developed an immunity to the sting from the nematocysts, but other fish probably haven't. And so these guys can hide and benefit from the stinging cells protecting them. Other predators won't come near them. And then when they poop, their feces actually serves as great food for the anemone. So it's a mutualistic relationship. Sounds kind of gross, but it works for them. So let's see. Here's another example of a type of member of this class of anthozoan. Corals are like anemones, but they're colonial. So a coral has kind of the same body shape, except they're connected to each other by little thin layers of tissue, like here and here. So the corals are a giant colony of these polyps, as you can see. So if you look, from a distance, you probably can't tell, but when you look closely, you see just thousands and thousands of these little polyps. And they secrete a hard calcium carbonate, kind of a substrate underneath them. So it's like a skeleton that's left behind. So when you find a piece of coral that's washed up on the beach, chances are what you're holding is not the actual animal itself, but the skeleton that's left over after the animal died. That's the hard white part of the coral. So there can be thousands of individuals in a colony. And what's amazing about corals is that they actually usually have a symbiotic mutualistic relationship with a type of algae called zooxanthellae. And the algae live embedded in the tissue, in the epidermis of the coral. And the zooxanthellae will do photosynthesis and produce food that both the algae and the coral benefit from. And in exchange, the coral provides some nutrients from its own filter feeding with its tentacles and a substrate for the zooxanthellae to live in. So that's pretty cool. Corals are usually soft. A lot of the time they look more like plants than animals. And so, somebody sees this, they might think it's a plant, not really an animal. So it's just something to be aware of, that looks can be deceiving in the ocean. So members of Cnidaria, typically they digest prey in their gastrovascular cavity. They basically just secrete enzymes that dissolve them. And the hydrozoans and anthozoans, so that's the hydras and then anemones and corals, are suspension feeders or filter feeders. So they can't just go out and get food, whereas jellyfish, scyphozoans, are predatory carnivores. So these guys will actually go out and hunt. They can catch fish in their tentacles and eat them that way. Some types of jellyfish, here's a fun fact. This is the upside down jellyfish. It's called Cassiopeia. These guys actually have no true mouth, so they just absorb food across their tentacles, which is pretty cool. Life cycles I won't get into too much, just kind of explain how the polyp stage takes hold. So the hydrozoa, for example, here's a hydra. It will release a medusa that's the kind of the juvenile or larval stage. That medusa will release an egg and sperm. When fertilization occurs, that little juvenile or planula will settle and then grow into a new polyp of its own. So that's how that life cycle can work for most cnidarians. Jellyfish, it's kind of the opposite. They do have a polyp, but that's their juvenile phase. Their adult phase is the medusa. So the young medusa will the young medusa will grow into an adult, and then the adult will lay eggs, The eggs will form a little planula which settles and grows into a polyp.